Thanks, Heidi, for being up for sharing some of your learning and experience on peer facilitation from the perspective of Moray Wellbeing Hub. So, a very warm welcome. I'm wondering, Heidi, if we could start by just you introducing yourself and a wee bit of context into Moray Wellbeing Hub as an organisation.
Sure, thanks, Holly. Yep, so I'm Heidi Tweedie, and I'm the Social Movement and Enterprise Lead at Moray Wellbeing Hub. So I think even in my title, it tells you a little bit about what Moray Wellbeing Hub does. It's got sort of two sections that we kind of talk about that interlink with each other. One can't exist without the other. So on one side, we are a social movement of people. So we've got over 300 people in the Moray area who have signed up to be champions. So I'm a champion. Everybody that does delivery as part of the team is also a champion, regardless of if they're paid or volunteer or what they do. And then we have the social enterprise part, which is about how we, I guess, are the engine to make that work happen. So how we create change as an organization, because the money's got to come from somewhere. So although we do a lot of grant-based work, we also can do things as a social enterprise where we do things like consultancy and delivering training courses for like other organizations and things and helping them out.
Ah,
So I thought it might be just helpful just to kind of just for folk just to see this is our wee website and just to give you an idea of the kinds of projects and the things that we do. We have our projects and partners page, which you can see we do a lot of collective voice work. So we gather lots of things from people as they're living them in the Moray area about mental health, about alcohol and drug use, and about a whole bunch of other themes as well. And we support that to get back to health and social care. We do stuff on research. We do a lot on digital inclusion. We've done projects on parent and infant mental health. Peer support is really important to us. And we are part of the founding members of the National Peer Support Network. And we've got a bunch of like experience panels and action groups where people with living experiences and lived experiences can come together and like make change together. And we
oh,
do things like walks of hope and stuff like that in the community. So there's a whole bunch of things that we do.
great, Heidi. That was a lovely snapshot. Nice to have a bit of a visual as well. Um, so you're here with us to share some kind of experience and learning from around peer facilitation and the role that it plays within your activities in Moray Wellbeing Hub. And just again to sort of set the scene, what does peer facilitation look like in Moray Wellbeing Hub? What are the kind of roles and opportunities?
So I think there within Moray Wellbeing Hub, you have a specific role, which is called a peer facilitator. So that's pretty direct and straightforward. And for people that want to deliver that, whether that's paid or in an unpaid capacity, we consider that to be a formal role that requires like specific training and support
Mhm.
to do that. So there's that particular role, but also within the organization and within the champions movement of people who are doing activity, people facilitate as peers.
Mhm.
So I think that's really important to recognize that people hold space, whether it's one-to-one or they hold space within groups to do a whole bunch of different things. And I think what's really interesting about the way that we work is everyone is a peer. So everyone, no matter what kind of role they hold, is a champion first and foremost. So in that way, we support people to have done basic courses like for us, peer-to-peer is really core for people to understand how do they use their peer experiences. And then they'll have a variety of different roles that they might even facilitate within that. So they might be facilitating other team members even to help them to connect as part of like how we support our organization.
Mhm. Mhm. Fab. And so thinking about the more formal peer facilitator role, what does that look like in practice? What might that look like and feel like actually for the person in the role and participating in things that the person's facilitating?
So I think maybe, I mean, some of the things that I was showing there online, the kind of things that we're up to give an indication. So obviously your courses, that's a key one that people think about. So we talk about structured and unstructured spaces as peer facilitators. And what we do is we devised an internal course to be able to support people to think about these because they require quite different things. And actually what we've found over the years is that whilst all peer facilitators or people that hold a peer facilitation aspect of their role, they can deliver these things. There are people who lean one way or another. So there are people who like to lean into structured spaces. So that's things like a course where you've got a content that you're maybe delivering a set of resources, exploring those together with the people that are there. And you know that you finish at this time, you start at that time, you have learning outcomes, that kind of thing. So they could be delivering peer-to-peer, for example, or they're delivering Chime for Wellbeing, or they're delivering being a good supporter, which is like a basic mental health first aid, that kind of thing. Then we also have unstructured spaces, and those are things where you're holding maybe a peer support group, or you're holding a drop-in or a walk, and you know your beginning and end, but anything can kind of happen in the middle. People can turn up at different times. Like it's all got a big old flow. And that's a very different thing when you're hosting that space. And I guess that's a key word that we talk about a lot is this idea of you're hosting. When you're facilitating, it's really not shorthand for teaching or training. And so we try and make sure that everybody is really mindful of that language. You don't need to have all of the answers, regardless if it's structured or unstructured. What you do need to be able to do is focus on the experience that people are going to have and make sure that the values are sort of flowing through you as a peer.
I think that use of language in hosting, it's powerful, and it does it feels a lot more mutual, doesn't it? And you spoke about the experience, like what kind of things are important in creating that more mutual experience for people participating?
I think the basics for any space that a peer is going to hold. What's different about that, for say, from another facilitated space, is I think it feels different first and foremost, both for the people who are attending and for the facilitator. There's a different feel. And because they're focusing on the hear me values in terms of their delivery, I think that what you've got to think about is, how am I going to create hope in this space? How am I going to create empowerment in this space? How am I going to mindfully make use of my living and lived experience in this space? And very clear with people that it has to create that well-being for you as a facilitator too. Yes, you're doing this for people, but you're not in service of them. So I think a lot of what we're talking about here is boundaries, which is always important in facilitation, of like, this is what's on the cards and this is what's not on the cards. It's the how that's done that feels different. It's the how that's done that is different in terms of what kind of values you're pulling into that, and taking a really strong values approach that comes from the evidence base around what works in peer support.
So what I'm getting from that is that the values sit as the foundation, as the kind of role and experience, and then you've touched on some of the things like around boundaries. So what I was going to sort of then ask was, so what are the things, what happens in the space to make it feel peer, make it feel more mutual, some of those more practical things?
So I suppose I can talk, I suppose, as I'm a facilitator myself. And for example, you can use your peer facilitation approach to deliver anything. So I'm also a mental health first aid trainer, and I've been delivering that course for a very long time. And the language around that and the way that we're trained is to be a trainer. And that doesn't mean it isn't a supportive environment. It doesn't mean any of those things. But the peer facilitation is like, wraps a blanket around all of that. In order to get to that core, you have to go through some layers. And the peer facilitation journey starts right at the beginning when you're advertising or promoting something, when you want people to come to it. So that might be word of mouth, or it might be using, promotion through social media or posters or whatever. But again, considering the values at that stage. How is this going to work in terms of lots of different people? And how is this going to convey that this is going to be a different experience for
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
There's that layer. We quite often talk about it in a way, it's a bit like it's an envelope. You have this around everything. So you're ramping in, even with the pre-questions, if you're going to do a course, you might not do that for an unstructured space, but how are you going to get people's feedback on what it was that worked well for them, what it is that they enjoyed, but in a strength-based way that, again, helps give the values feel. And then I guess coming into the space, it's in everything that people do in terms of creating that welcome. So when you're training something, you'll have in your mind the learning objectives that you have to deliver, for example. You must do X. You must get through this course material. And whilst that's important, what's more important is that people come away with an increased sense of chime. And chime is best done through peer-to-peer connection. So in order to do that, we have to build in some mechanisms to help the planning and the delivery. And what we do is we've created things like, I spoke about the course that we've kind of done internally for team members to get them to reflect. Some of them are very experienced facilitators and trainers, but it's very different when they come to do peer facilitation. They've had to kind of turn almost everything they know on their head, because quite often as a facilitator or trainer, you're supposed to kind of have that distance between you. You're doing your thing, you're looking after people, but you're not of that group. Whereas what you've got to do when you're a peer facilitator is you've got to kind of come into the group enough that you've got a peer connection, but not get sucked into that so that you become part of the cohort. You've got to somehow sit slightly outside of that. So you're constantly on this little journey. And that's another reason why it's really important for the majority of these spaces that you have a seconder. You have a second person, and that can be challenging in terms of like if people are free and, you know, costs and things like that. But that person just needs to be somebody on that journey. They need to be somebody who can keep an eye out. So for example, in delivery of any kind of sessions, we always make sure that there's a post-it by the door, and that the second person is always at a minimum trained in sort of mental health, first aid and signposting skills, even if they're a volunteer for that session, no matter what it is. So if someone takes that post-it, someone can go with them and have a little side conversation and to check in with them. And I think that's so vitally important because people don't actually use it an awful lot, but the minute that you put it up, it creates that envelope. And the other key feature is always a group agreement.
Yeah.
And as a facilitator trainer of any kind of space, structured or unstructured, you always need something that says this is how we're going to behave in this space. And you may even do it with the group to a degree, but what you're making sure is that again contains chime, that again allows you to deliver the hear me values in the space. That's the different thing, I think.
I really like what you're saying there in terms of the mechanisms. And, you know, it's not about whether they're used or not used, but actually it's about them being in place and then the impact of having them in place and how that makes people feel. And so, yeah, it's really good to hear about some of those practical things, because I'd imagine people are thinking, you know, so what happens in the space? What happens when a space is being facilitated, and what are some of those mechanisms? Are there any other mechanisms that you feel would be useful to share?
Yeah, so we've talked about the group agreement. We've talked about, I guess we always try and ensure food and drink is always a key component. And again, that might be something that many trainers and facilitators think about, but it's again making that front and fore. And that is, in some ways, that stuff is more important than whatever it is that you're trying to get a core of. It's when we are working with humans, these are humans, fellow humans who have had experiences where the power dynamic has been very different, and they can react quite strongly because of their own experiences of trauma, because of the smell of the room, because of the way that you put a presentation up, because of sensory thing, all kind of manner of things could be going on. And the more that you can kind of just show them it's different, the brain can stop going into that crisis and distress response and think it's an emergency. Because I think that's the other thing is what I've noticed can be quite a challenge sometimes for facilitators holding a group is when they're peers, one of the things that can happen is you can end up supporting each other
Mhm.
or supporting individuals, but you have to create a group space as well.
Mhm.
Like
Mhm.
that's another thing that you have to hold. So you have an awful lot of things to kind of hold,
Yeah.
and you have to deliver some sort of material,
Mhm.
or you're in an unstructured space where people could appear at any second.
Mhm.
I mean, not forgetting, of course, that one-to-one
Mhm.
relationships and experiences can be facilitated spaces as well.
Mhm. Yeah.
We tend to do slightly less of those
Mhm.
simply because of the kind of work that we do.
Yeah.
But when we are doing some of that, you're just pulling the same thing in. It's like, again, what's your agreement with that human being? Like, what time are you going to finish? What do they need and what do you need to have well-being in that situation?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's something about the attention to detail that I think stands out from what you've been saying, and just being there's many things to kind of be aware of, and also then how you just keep the values like at the foundation. And
Yeah,
some of these things you would be doing in other facilitation roles, or if you were in a teaching role, but actually when like it's there's something about how you bring the peer, how you bring in the
yes.
peer into the space, and in at the center of the mechanisms that are uh, you know essential to creating the space that you're facilitating.
I would
um
say it's the order.
yeah.
When you're talking about it there, Holly, a lot of what I've just said, probably people say, well, yeah, that's the same thing.
Hmm.
And I remember going to some training and people saying to me, no, no, this is the same thing. On paper, it can look like the same thing. It feels completely different. And I
Absolutely.
guess we don't have all the answers as an organization, but we're exploring that from a perspective of like, how do we create some like mechanisms and
Yeah.
processes that help people? Key to
Yeah.
this is reflective
Yeah.
practice. And that's so important. So we have that built in different ways. When people are starting their journey,
Hmm.
um, obviously, once we've kind of trained them on some of the basics and they feel confident that they're going to give it a whirl, we do a QA process with them where a more experienced facilitator will be in the room and makes themselves really, really clear that they're there to celebrate the human who is delivering. They're not there to assess them in a negative way, but they're there. And they're also there as a backup because, you know, sometimes when people go into peer facilitation, they freeze because it is quite different and they can have practiced lots of things, but stuff happens in the room.
Hmm.
So the experience is the only thing that you have to pull on. And if you're someone that's newer, you then have a second person ready to step in and help hold that with permission. So that's quite exciting because what happens in that again is we've got documentation that we've created that makes clear the hear me values, tries to get people to think about using their own examples. They do a reflective practice. The person in the room does a reflective practice, and then they have a meeting to explore that together and to think about next steps. Going further down the line, people do that for each other. So they'll like, if they're co-facilitating, they'll do that for each other so that they can hear some of the things that they're maybe not noticing they're doing well and celebrate that.
Hmm.
And then just generally as an organization, every single interaction thing that we do, output, we
Hmm.
do a reflective practice on it. We
Hmm.
always have our chime reflection sheet and we think about what happened in the space, how did it create chime for people, and how did it create chime for us? And I think that that's really important. We have digital solutions to that as part of our, tools that we use. So originally that was on paper. Now we use digital tools to collect that. And that then is also then part of your like evaluation and your monitoring and stuff like that as well.
I think something that really stands out from that is, you know, it's not about, what created chime for other people, but actually recognizing, and it brings that mutuality again, like how was chime created for me or for us. And I also love that there's a real kind of strong sense of like, I guess, support and mentorship and celebration. Um, as you develop your skills and confidence as a peer facilitator, that is not about like assessment in a kind of deficit kind of way, but it's actually like, let's identify those strengths and celebrate what you're doing, and doing that in a really supportive way alongside someone who has maybe been doing it for a little bit longer. Um, Thank you Heidi, for sharing that. I'm getting conscious of the time. And I think that's really captured. I was going to ask you kind of what that process for peer facilitators looks like in terms of support from the organization. I think you've really captured that. I guess just to finish, I love finishing on a little top tips. What would be your top tips for people who are interested in fine-tuning their peer facilitation skills?
I think the most important thing is to have the aid memoir, something built in that pushes you before you're going into that space, during that space, and after that space to get you back to the values. So whatever that is that you have to create for yourself, do it.